Now let's dive into one of the most exciting features in Unreal Engine 5.8, which would be the mesh terrain. So we can now compare the good old landscape mode against the new mesh terrain. The landscape mode has been around for quite some time now, and for many years it's been the go-to for building big environments. It's stable, it's production ready, and we can use powerful features like world partition to save performance and the PCG system on top of it. But it's limited to simply being a low poly mesh that gets displaced by height information, either through a height map or the sculpting tools. The mesh terrain now comes in handy for a simple reason: we can sculpt it like an actual mesh and not just displace it like a simple plane. We can create tunnels, real cliffs, real geometry, because that is exactly what's missing in the landscape mode. It also uses a non-destructive workflow of stacking modifiers we can change, delete or rearrange at any time. So nothing is really baked right away. It works just like the procedural content generator. And it will work together with the PCG quite nicely in the future. Sadly enough, Unreal Engine 5.8 is still experimental, so we can only use some features for now, and some are not yet implemented, such as applying textures or painting on the mesh. But this would change when 5.8 is officially released. But it's important to learn the mesh terrain's available features and how to operate inside it first. So let's start trying out mesh terrain's new features. Just a simple thing you should keep in mind is we have some obvious shadow glitches here. This is because I enabled ray traced shadows. So let me show you how to enable ray traced shadows for more accurate shadow calculations. Just go to Edit, Project Settings, type in Ray Trace, enable ray traced shadows, and there you go. You don't even need to restart your project. Now we can get rid of these shadow glitches caused by ray traced shadows, especially when you use nanite meshes. Those types of shadow glitches appear. This is because the so-called normal bias doesn't really like how nanite meshes and meshes in general are being calculated when it comes to the surface direction and how light and shadows are being rendered. You can either increase the value of the ray traced normal bias by simply typing into the console command on the bottom r.raytracing.normalBias and increase its value, or simply type in r.raytracing.shadows.enable two-sided geometry and set the value to 0. So now in order to get the mesh terrain, let's go to File, New Level. And what is really necessary here is you need to have an open world or empty open world. The reason why that is because you can see on the right hand side in our outliner, we have the world partition map only for the open world or for the empty open world. So get this one, because this is something we need for mesh terrain. Now everything is dark because it's an empty level. Let's go to Window. And here you can go and open up the environment light mixer and then just simply add a skylight, a directional light, a sky atmosphere. We don't need volumetric cloud, and then you can add the height fog. As for the exponential height fog, just scroll down and enable the volumetric fog. So we're gonna have better fog effect. Now you can see we have the landscape, but also I have the mesh terrain here by pressing Shift 6, but the mesh terrain is something you do not have yet. So just go to Edit, then go to Plugins. And when you type in mesh terrain, you can simply enable the mesh terrain mode. You might just need to restart. And then before you restart, he's going to ask you to save, just save level as, and open up the third person folder and just override your default map and save it. And feel free now to restart. So now after restart, we can now open up the mesh terrain here, and we're gonna have a bunch of settings. Let's click on create a rectangle. Now you can see that we have a really big rectangle because the size you can see here is 100K by 100K. This is pretty big and quite heavy for the PC. So let's just crank it down to something like 1000 by 1000. resolution, we just keep it. Let's accept. You can just double click on your mesh partition and there you have it. You can see it's divided into 4 sections. And when we change the perspective to top, you can now see how big that is. So on the bottom left, you can see that size would be 1 meter. And when you just hold a middle mouse button and drag, you can see that we do have approximately, or actually exactly 10 by 10 meters. So 1000 by 1000 Unreal Engine units is basically 1000 by 1000 centimeters. Let's go back to perspective. Now, as for the functions inside our mesh terrain, we can also import a height map, which we're gonna do in the next lecture. And we can also later draw a spline. This is basically for the mesh terrain to have a road, for example. So the convert function is basically, if you have a simple mesh or you have your own nanite mesh, you're gonna import a complex mesh, you can convert this into a mega mesh. Now here you have modifiers. This is basically something you have in Blender as well. You can add different commands, which is non-destructive, and you can change the order when to use what kind of modifier first. And you can always go back. You can add texture patches and noise. You can add extra splines, so on and so forth. For the sculpting tool, this is something we can try out right away. So when you just hit the Sculpt N tool, let's just sculpt here and create a generic hill. You can now move if you want. Certain parts you can move here. And remember, this is not a displaced mesh, only using the height information. Like I said earlier, this is actual geometry we now sculpt on. You can also increase the strength. You can pinch, but in my opinion, pinch is not really something you should do. So let me just use the smooth brush here, but actually, let me just undo that. We can flatten, which is also similar to the flatten brush in our landscape mode. But what's really interesting here is the height flatten. So you can see here, especially if you have a game environment and you have hills, you can also make it accessible here and flatten that hill. This is pretty cool. So we now have a plateau. We have also the zero height brush. This is also a flatten tool, but it's just gonna flatten out everything and putting our up vector, our Z vector back to 0. So we have the same height for everything untouched. The slope erode is pretty cool. So you can just sculpt at those slopes and get this natural erosion. Pretty sweet. And you can also use the height smooth and just clean it up a little bit. Here is the paint section, but like I said before, paint maps is not really gonna work here. Those features are being implemented with the official release, I guess. So paint maps, that one would be later for us to apply textures. It's basically like a mesh paint. And you can see there's also an option for vertex color paint. So this is something I'm definitely gonna look forward to. Here under shapes, you can now add box, sphere, cylinder, capsule, cone. But in this case, let me just get a cylinder. You can just place it here. It's using the normal, so the direction of our surface. And here, let's increase the radius or decrease, because I want to create a tunnel, and we can just use this as a boolean to cut out. our actual mesh. Here the height, you can give it a little more height, just to make it a little longer. And radial slice, you should put this up to 32 maybe. Height is subdivision, you can also just give it more geometry in terms of height here. And then hit accept. Now, when we go back to modifiers, you can see we have a boolean here. You can just simply drag and drop this. So let me just put this here. I want to cut over there. But now we only have a cube. And this is not something we really want to do. Instead, I open up the mesh section under our boolean modifier here. And we have a mesh component here. And when you open up the source mode, you can put this to a static mesh. And now we can add a static mesh. When you check this cylinder here, let me just click on this one in our mesh terrain. You can see when we scroll up, this static mesh has a pretty weird name. So cylinder 8A and so on and so forth. When we go back to our boolean modifier, we can now add this static mesh down here in our mesh section. And then just open up the mesh and get this cylinder. And now you need to be careful because it's going to take a little while to compile. Inside our boolean modifier here, we can now get this static mesh. Let's go to rotate and make sure that you have this 90 degrees rotation being snapped. And now we can just simply rotate this one 90 degrees right away. Toggle with spacebar. So let me just move this one inside so it covers the whole hill. Let me just move it up a little bit. And here you can see we can cut a nice hole here. So a nice tunnel. So in order to do that, we need to open up our bool section here. And under the bool section, we have this bool operation, which is the subtract in this case. You can also use the trim, but subtract works best for us now in this case. So you can see it's already creating a hole. We can just click on this original bool, static mesh, sorry, and we can just delete this one. Now when we go back to selection, you can now see that we created a tunnel. It's pretty cool. Just a quick tip I want to sneak in between here is you can see using a directional light in our environment, especially like I said with the ray traced shadows, you can see that our shadows are still a little too sharp. They are now correct as in terms of shading, but still you can see the outline of those shadows here are a little too sharp in my case. So you can always go back to the directional light. And under the ray tracing section, you can find something called the shadow source angle factor. And you might just want to increase that to something like 12 or 16. And then you can see that those shadows produced by our directional light are actually much smoother. And that's it for today. I hope you learned something, basic navigation inside the mesh terrain. And if you want to learn more, feel free to check out one of my environment courses, where we're gonna dive deep into game environment creation and detailed hard surface modeling.